the exploited. This is the exploiter.
Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school.
Is it right that so many people live in such poverty in a society surrounded by such riches? No, it obviously is not.
Because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions.
Hello, you're listening to Red in the Face. I'm Dan and we'll be hosting this episode. I'm joined by Jarrad and another very special guest. This week on the pod, we're joined by Joe Ryle, who is a campaigner for the 4-Day Week campaign. He is the media and comms lead for the think tank Autonomy UK and is a former advisor to John McDonnell and a former Labour Party press officer. Joe's going to be talking to us today about the 4-Day Week. And thanks so much for coming on the show, Joe.
Hi, thanks for having me on. Thank you.
So just to begin with, then we'll just sort of ask you about yourself, if that's all right. How did you get involved with the 4-Day Week campaign, and how does that tie into sort of other projects and campaigns and work you've done previously or currently doing?
Yeah, so I guess it was when I was working for John McDonnell actually that I first sort of became aware of this policy idea of a 4-day working week, which funnily enough was at a time, I bet you can imagine, working some of the longest hours I think I ever have done in my life, and on weekends, and it was non-stop, especially working in the press office. And I guess on a personal level, working 5 or 6 or 7 years full time, it really took its toll in terms of like burnout, stress, overwork, and also actually on a personal level, I kind of felt that lost a kind of sense of my own self identity in the world, where my life became so dominated by work, particularly working in what was exciting times in a very exciting job. But it was I remember hearing about the 4-Day Week and the 4-Day Week campaign, which has existed for about 4 or 5 years now. And I was actually the one that got them in the room with Andrew Fisher and some of the kind of Corbyn's key policy advisors, and that was the kind of start of those conversations in the Labour Party, which led to Labour Party inevitably backing it at the 2019 election and in their manifesto, which was the kind of biggest success for the 4-Day Week campaign at that time.
Sort of, I mean, we do this every time with guests, and I understand that it's not as simple as that. But if you were to give your headline sort of pin it on a wall answer for what the 4-Day Week essentially fundamentally means, and why, as the left, it should be something that, if we've obviously talked about for a while, we should be talking about more and should be really at the forefront of everything that we're doing, talking about reducing working hours.
Yeah, so I mean, I think importantly is first to just say what the 4-Day Week is, because it does get confused sometimes, and people have different interpretations of it. So what we mean by a 4-Day Week is a 4-day, 32-hour working week with no reduction in pay for workers, and that's what we campaign for. I mean, the call for reduction in working hours is a long demand of the trade union movement and has been for the last 100 years. It was the trade union movement that won the weekend and the 40-hour week back in the 1930s and 40s, but essentially in this, bringing it forward to today, all the statistics show that workers are really burnt out, stressed, overworked. I think it's more than 2/3 of workers were stressed or overworked in their job before the pandemic, and we know the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of these trends. And so, I guess the main benefit of moving to a 4-day week is the huge boost you'd get in mental health and worker well-being, from people having a better work-life balance, essentially.
And I mean, you've touched on it there, sort of looking at the pandemic specifically. Do you think that we'll talk about sort of it being adopted as a conference and things like that in a little bit. What role do you think the pandemic has played in terms of? I mean, I would say there's been perhaps a slowly but surely a culture shift in people's minds, that realizing that actually being at home and spending time with family and doing things that you didn't have time to do before and things like that basically the pandemic has changed people's perception of what role work should play in their life? And do you think that's had an important impact on the 4-day weeks campaign, and sort of, they've played into each other really?
Oh, it's been huge, I think people have actually, which was one of our, I have to say, that was partly our strategy, was to move the policy on from it being seen as a Corbyn policy, because, we didn't want it to be associated with what was such a historic loss, was that 29 election, to be blunt. I think, the pandemic has really been the thing that's brought the idea to life. And that's, I think, why we've seen it gaining in such popularity and momentum, not just in the UK, but also, across the world, from New Zealand, Spain. I can talk about some of those examples in a bit in more detail. And why has that happened? I mean, there's lots of reasons for it. One of the main one being that, the entire world of work was completely thrown up in the air because of the pandemic, and things that seemed impossible before the pandemic hit. For example, the majority of workers moving to work from home pretty much overnight, I think has opened people's eyes to the fact that the world of work can change very quickly when we want it to. Alongside that, you've had many workers, and of course not everyone, there's been key workers going out every single day working just as hard as ever, but for many people they've had more time on their hands, and I think that's allowed them to reimagine their future and to kind of take stock of what, how they would improve their lives and how life would become better after the pandemic. And we hear a lot about this build back better phrase, but surely improving our work-life balance has got to be, and improving the world of work has got to be at the forefront of building back better from the pandemic. And the furlough scheme as well, more than, I think at certain points, more than half of the workforce having their wages paid by the government. All of these things have been dramatic interventions in the labour market, and I think that's opened people's eyes to the fact change can happen very quickly when we want it to. So we hope the 4-day week is going to be at the forefront of that.
I think with the pandemic, however, as a slight counterpoint, just from my own personal experience, when I was in the office, it was a very much, I get there at 9, I finish at 5, and that's it. However, I've noticed from working from home, and it's something because I'm a rep within my workplace, that I've held discussions about, because there's no monitoring of when people are logging off. And in my role, I'm looking at my emails. I'm getting emails at 10:30, 11 o'clock from people. And it's that culture shift may have occurred with many people. I think it could have the opposite effect with some other people, where they're not switching off because their home has become their workplace, that they can't decipher there between the two. So I was just going to say, how do you sort of get around that challenge? Because a lot of companies, when you raise it with them, they sort of rather not know it's happening, if that makes sense, because obviously it's to their benefit. So how do you get around sort of that issue?
It's a really important point. I mean, I think there was a report out a couple of weeks ago which showed that overall working hours have actually gone up by about 1.5 hours because of the pandemic, which is a really worrying trend. And it's not surprising, because there is no checks and balances in place in terms of when you start and when you log off when you're working from home, and I think it's really important that that's looked at. In France, they introduced a kind of right to disconnect law. I can't remember when it was, about 5 to 10 years ago, which does give workers the right to not check emails and that sort of thing after a certain hour. And I think that's another law which should be looked at for the UK, because it is really problematic with us carrying around our work now on our smartphone wherever we go, and just never being able to switch off. And that all of those little checks, even if you're just checking your emails on the bus on the way to work, that's still working, and that adds up to the total tally of hours you're working. So it has, you're right. The pandemic has been it's exposed the kind of problems in the world of work, and has exposed inequalities in other areas, but hasn't and has triggered the debate, which I think has given prominence to the 4-day week as an idea. But the reality on the ground is that people are working longer, which does show, I think, the need for a policy intervention like the 4-day week and reduction of working hours more generally. Because if we just leave it to itself, then people will just be working more hours. So there are some encouraging signs, which I can talk about in a bit, in terms of companies adopting 4-day week, governments looking at national level pilots in Scotland and Spain. So
I think with that, that also comes into a little bit sort of why it's so important for the left and the trade union movement to really put the foot, on the accelerator with the 4-day week. And like you say, it's a continuation of a centuries of struggle in terms of reducing the working week and optimizing leisure time. That added into that is sort of like the idea of like sort of precarious work and the gig economy and things like that. That the idea of the old conception of the working week is already breaking down anyway. The 9 to 5 Monday to Friday isn't actually most people's lived reality, particularly younger people. But probably very few younger people actually do a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job. So do you think that's sort of why the opportunity for this campaign is to really build some momentum is there, because those old sort of foundations around the working day and the working week are, even if they're breaking down negatively on workers, it gives sort of the opportunity for us to make a really compelling case for actually this is how your work-life balance should work. You don't have to work all these hours, etc., etc.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hope that the COVID pandemic will effectively kill off the 9 to 5, 5-day working week. Which, let's remember, is absolutely ridiculous that is still the norm. The 9 to 5 5-day working week is based on a 1940s agricultural or industrial economy. That's where it comes from, and it's quite frankly bizarre that across the entire world that has still remained the norm still today, despite automation, new technology, all of these things that were promised as part of the promise was that it was going to free us up to have more free time. And it's a particular problem for the UK. Since the 1980s, working hours in the UK have barely reduced at all. We work some of the longest full-time hours in the world, longest full-time hours compared to any other EU country except for Greece, while having one of the least productive economies and the fewest number of bank holidays. So, it really is a problem that's exacerbated in the UK. Yeah.
Sorry, Jarrad, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think something that I've noticed is you're almost having, it is a massive culture change, especially with, well, I can't comment on other countries because it might be similar, but I know with sort of British people, it is like they almost say it with like pride that they've worked 60 hours or 75 hours this week, and it's just like, why are you proud of that? That, like, in order to earn a living, you've worked. Like, do you remember that TikTok of that guy who said he worked at fucking Asda on the night or something, Tesco in the afternoon, at Amazon doing deliveries, and he was like, yeah, this is the grift or something. Just like, I don't want to be rude, but
I was going to say,
across a bit of like a mug, like
particularly amongst younger people, that culture now, like that, and it's maybe more American, but it's definitely coming in Britain. That culture of like you say, the grift, or you're like the side job, and it's like that. I understand why you may be proud that you are putting the hours in, and as a result, you might be able to do better than just keeping your head above water. But the fact that it's quite scary, like you say, that maybe is permeating its way through to become the norm.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? Like, why is it a badge of honor to be showing off that you're working all the time? Why is that something that should be honored? Surely in life it should be a badge of honor to have loads of friends, or to have a good social life, or to have a nice family, or whatever it is. And of course everyone needs to earn a living, and people take, it's great if people take pride in their jobs, and people enjoy their jobs, but it shouldn't dominate our lives in the way that it does. It's quite when you step back from it a little bit and look at the context, the fact that we work 5 of our 7 days, if not more in some cases, for a boss, basically, for our bosses. It's a lot of our time. And we feel quite confident about the kind of making the case for a 4-day week in this moment, and there does seem to be now a sort of growing inevitability about the need to move to working hours, particularly around some of the arguments around unemployment, because there's a strong argument that in time, if you look back at history, where shorter working hours have been implemented, that in times of economic crisis and recession, shorter working hours is often a good strategy for sharing existing work more equally across the economy, which has the effect of reducing unemployment. So it does feel like I have to say, it does feel like we're winning the argument on a 4-day week. I know the Conservatives they don't seem to be attacking it anymore in the way that they were the 2019 general election. And even one of Rishi Sunak's responses to the coronavirus pandemic was a shorter hours scheme. So there's definitely ground to be won there, we think.
I think on that as well, in terms of winning the argument, perhaps part of that is as a trade union movement is to, you know, continually be sort of reinforcing to trade unionists and workers that what we do have in terms of the weekend, for example, was fought and won by workers. That's not a natural thing that just sort of cropped up one day and all of a sudden we have Saturday and Sunday off. That's there because we fought for it over, as we say, sort of centuries and things like that. So that's also like quite an important element to be like, well, it's for us to demand these things, not just to sort of wait until it's handed down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, there are cases of companies moving to the 4-day week and bosses just doing it, which is great. There was some polling out recently, that showed that 5% of companies in the UK are already working a 4-day week, which is quite a significant number. But yeah, we can't expect bosses to, in all cases, just hand it over. And that you know, there is the trade union movement needs to also be at the forefront of this move to a 4-day week through collective bargaining, which we're starting to see as well. Not just had more companies getting in touch with us in terms of asking for advice on implementing it, but also workers getting in touch with us and saying, how do I demand this through my workplace? And, you know, and the answer to that is you start a union branch, get your workers involved and use your collective bargaining process to demand a 4-day week. And I think we're starting to see that more and more, which is exciting.
What has the trade union response been? I imagine it would be overwhelmingly positive, but I know there may be some concerns about, I don't know, maybe sort of potential redundancies or sort of the scaremongering that comes along with it. And also, I think this campaign is probably like the hardest one to do because you're having to change as well. I think because we've discussed it on the podcast before, the trade union movement for the past 20 years has been a relatively sort of reactive force. So it's always constantly having to react to change or react to legislation. But with this one, you're sort of having to put pressure and you're trying to change mindsets and you're being proactive in doing it. So does that pose sort of challenges as well? Like, has the trade union movement been completely in support of it, or what has the response been?
Pretty much completely supportive. I mean, they've kind of all said that, which is the right thing, that, you know, the pandemic has meant that their focus and priority has to be on protecting jobs and saving jobs as much as possible, which makes sense. So I don't think the 4-day week and reducing working hours is their sort of top number one priority. But yeah, across the board from TUC, Unite, CWU, PCS, that, you know, they all and Unison, in fact, do have the 4-day working week as policies. They do back it. And I'd say, you know, Unite and CWU probably do a bit more than the others. Yeah. But yeah, they do back the policy. So there's kind of an ongoing discussion going on within that movement as well about whether the 4-day week is actually the thing that should be called for, and whether it should be a kind of general reduction in working hours that kind of comes down more gradually, you know. And yeah, we think that the ideal scenario, you know, if you kind of look at it across the board, the ideal amount of work would be 4 days, 32 hours, and that's about the right work-life balance. But we recognise that any win in any kind of reduction in working hours as a win is a good thing. So, you know, and the position we've carved out in terms of 4 days, 32 hours, no reduction in pay is a position that was come to with the trade unions. So, yeah, we're working alongside them very closely.
In terms of, I think, maybe moving on to some of the common things that we hear regarding the 4-day week, and we'll talk about maybe some of the difficulties in the past of explaining it as a policy. Looking towards the first thing that gets looked at would be productivity. I mean, maybe first, obviously we'll talk about the benefits for workers. It is clear, like you said previously, greater leisure time as a worker, that's brilliant. You know, having the mental health benefits of a 4-day week is obvious as well. You know, there's benefits to other industries, arts, culture, domestic tourism. You know, the idea that you might actually have time to do something creative with your life and not sort of just get home and sink into the sofa sort of thing. It's all obvious as a trade unionist and as workers why that's a positive. What's we've seen a few examples now. I think are they called Unilever in New Zealand have gone for a 4-day week. Why is it that there are some examples of companies going to 4-day week working weeks, and how is it that we can make the case successfully to employers that this is actually, whilst I know we're workers, sometimes we don't give shit about employers, but how do we make the case to them that this actually is a net benefit to you and it's a net benefit for productivity in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been saying consistently that, you know, the 4-day week is a win-win for both workers and employers. And you know, you've already said it. The strongest argument for it is that wherever it seems to be trialed, productivity either goes up or stays the same. Tends to usually go up slightly, or stays the same. So you, 9 out of 10 cases, you're getting more work done or the same amount of work done in 4 days than 5. So that's a, you know, an obvious boost to productivity. And I think that more and more companies are starting to recognize that, which is exciting. And the more companies that do it, it seems to have a domino effect. That, you know, the more companies that do it, it seems to be always successful in terms of productivity. And you know, actually, some firms finding that they're performing even better than before, and that gives reassurance to business and companies that actually there isn't you're not going to get less from your workforce by going down to 4 days, because it's, you know, it's not rocket science. If you're overworked, burnt out, stressed, you're not going to be performing very well in your job. Whereas if you're much better rested, have more time for yourself, then you're going to come back in on a Monday morning and you're going to perform better at work. And that's kind of how that works. There's lots of other business arguments for it as well, in terms of increasingly now we're seeing that businesses who do move to a 4-day week are much more likely to be able to attract talent in terms of new hiring new people, because it's, you know, it's overwhelmingly popular. People want to be working 4 days, and a number of other business arguments too, which we're constantly trying to pitch to everyone. And I've been doing a lot of these kind of like going into businesses and business groups and doing talks and making the case, because there's encouraging signs, you know, from Unilever to Microsoft in Japan trialed the 4-day week a couple of years ago, and they found that their productivity went up by 40% on that move. And the Unilever one's quite big, because at the moment it's just the New Zealand office, but if they've said that if that trial is successful, then they're going to look to roll it out globally across their global workforce, which would be big. There's Buffer, the social media organization, who they moved to a 4-day week in the pandemic, and they found that in terms of all as you said, all the kind of worker well-being type scenarios all have massively improved, and productivity rose slightly. So, you know, there's been a success for them, and they've decided to keep it. So there's some bigger examples, and about 20 to 30 small businesses in the UK have now signed up to our accreditation scheme. So they're sort of recognised as official 4-day week companies, in the same way that the kind of Living Wage Foundation recognises living wage employers. So yeah, I think there's definitely a shift happening in the business world.
And in all those trials, was that off the back of sort of no redundancies as well, and basically all the normal terms and conditions all stayed the same? Basically, all that happened was productivity went up. That was the only change in those examples.
Yeah, and they've all gone with the model we've been calling for: 4-day, 32 hours, no reduction in pay, which is great. It tends to be that annual leave, you lose about 5 days annual leave, which is like 20% annual leave, but that makes sense, because, you know, you're getting an extra day off every week. But otherwise it's all the same kind of employment. Yeah,
it's incredible, really. It's that when you explain it like that, why there is any sort of people dragging their feet on this. I mean, when you speak to businesses specifically, what are the main things other than productivity? Do they come at you with anything else for this is why this can't happen, other than they think it's going to have a negative effect on productivity? Do they have any other arguments for why they don't think it would work in their specific workplace?
I think it's just a sort of, you know, a classic thing where people are scared of change. And, you know, we recognize that business doesn't like big changes in times of uncertainty, and the economy has been very uncertain for quite a long time. So we're feeling quite hopeful that, because we've made the case quite strongly, that once the economy does settle down a bit and becomes less uncertain, maybe later in the year when the worst bit of the COVID pandemic is over, that might be the moment where we see more companies doing it. There's a lot of people who just don't think it's realistic. And, you know, there is some sectors where it is harder to implement. For example, the service sector, like a restaurant, where, you know, you have to be open 5 days or 7. You don't have to, but to remain profitable, often have to remain open 5 days or even 7 days a week. And so that presents a more tricky situation in terms of implementation, because you've got to be a bit more strategic with the rota and shift patterns. To, people can't have the same day off, whereas in most offices you could just close the office on a Friday and everyone has the same day off. So it's definitely harder to implement in those roles. And there's definitely some businesses that would probably have to employ a couple of more people depending on the individual context. And we've kind of said that, if there is going to be a kind of national level subsidy to help us get to a 4-day week, as the Spanish and Scotland governments have announced, then that's probably where the funding should go, to those kind of sectors that are smaller, may struggle for profitability if they have to hire a few more staff to move everyone to 4 days.
Is that sometimes maybe part of the harder sell for some businesses, that with many of sort of big radical sweeping policies, they don't come on their own. They come with a package of things that need to be in place in order to support it. Is that sometimes the struggle getting people to think past, like you say, that idea of being a bit resistant to change, is that other things would have to change with it? It's not just a case of, right, everyone's working 4 days now. It's explaining that there would be things like, funds basically in a transitional period to try, and government funding to try and get us to that point. Is that maybe sometimes the difficulty in explaining it? Because people probably sometimes just read the headline 4-day week and just think, right, next week I'm in 4 days, rather than it being a bit like, if we were to have, say, UBI, it would be something that would be slowly trialed and across the country.
I mean, the evidence does suggest that the majority of firms could just implement a 4-day week overnight and remain profitable. So you are talking about a much smaller section of the workforce and employers and companies. But the 4-day week's not going to fix all of the problems in the economy. Take 0 hours contract workers, self-employed. At the moment, a 4-day week doesn't really mean anything to them, because in most cases they can't afford to reduce their pay and they don't have employment rights. So the solution there is boosting the living wage and scrapping 0 hours contracts, so workers have proper employment rights. So there are some other policies that need to come alongside the 4-day week for it to be implemented, across the board for everyone. But there's no reason why the government shouldn't have, the Labour policy was actually 10 years to get there, which actually I think was too long. I think we can get there sooner, something like within a parliament, 4 or 5 years. But there's no reason why the government couldn't, in the same way that France did in the early 2000s. They had introduced a 35-hour week, and there was a transition to get there. And that's what we need really, is a kind of ambition for 4 days, 32 hours by the end of the next parliament, and then it gives enough time for people to, for the entire economy to transition there.
And I think it plays in as well with this economy we've got. Like, it sort of ties into sort of the bullshit jobs sort of type thing as well, is that there's lots of sectors of our economy that are unproductive, and actually having them working in these jobs for 5 days that don't necessarily do a lot. It's one part of something sort of a lot wider, isn't it? So what would you say is, you say in some sort of transition period, say it's in a parliament, what needs to happen if it's sort of looking from the top down, first of all, in terms of what a government would need to do to make any sort of transition to a 4-day week a success? So there's some sort of like concrete policies that would have to go in place to make sure that it happens. So
yeah, they would need to fund it in the public sector, for example, in NHS and schools. So obviously it's interesting, NHS, because that was where the policy took quite a battering in the 2019 election, and that was mainly because Labour, and I say that as Labour press officer, they Labour Party messed up the comms on that, and you had Jonathan Ashworth and John McDonnell contradicting each other on whether it would apply in the NHS on the same morning in the media. So they didn't do the best on that one. But the hospitals would remain open on a 4-day week. It would just be that NHS workers would work 4 days, and so you would need to hire more nurses and doctors and NHS staff to make up, which we need to do anyway, because NHS vacancies I think there's over 100,000 NHS vacancies anyway today. So that would have some additional cost, but in the long run, that then that then does mean there's more people employed and you get more money back in tax breaks. So there's those kind of transitions which take a while to get there. And there's in the scheme they've got in Germany, which is quite interesting, is the Kurzarbeit scheme, which they've had since 2008, which basically effectively subsidise workers to move to 4 days, and the government subsidise the extra fifth day, which is widely seen as the kind of gold standard response to the 2008 economic crash. And they've kept that policy in place since 2008 because it's really helped to reduce unemployment. So they were able to hire, because a lot of people have gone down to 4 days, they're then able to hire more staff because of the extra work that's freed up. So it's policies like that which would, enable the transition and help us get to a 4 day week for everyone.
Yeah, something important as well is that maybe something that looking back at some sort of like Corbyn's Labour and some of the policies that we had, that the 4 day week is another classic example where it's not necessarily that other countries in Europe have a 4 day week, but other countries in Europe have a lot less, their average working hours are a lot less than the UK. And the ability to communicate the fact that actually what we're offering as part of this package is just what most Western countries already do. And the fact that Britain is actually just really, really far behind the curve on 1,000,001 things, be that, policies like free broadband and things like that. So how does the UK sort of compare in terms of, one, how governments are showing? I know you've mentioned a couple of examples there. I know the Scottish government are looking at it. How do Britain compare to sort of our views towards the 4 day week and the possibility of it happening here compared to Europe? I mean, are Europe already on a trend of the rest of Europe on a trend slowly of reducing their working hours already? And are we quite far behind? Or do you think that we're sort of slowly but surely, the campaign here is getting to a point where we're going to be on par with other European countries?
So in terms of popularity, it's just as popular, or if not more popular, than anywhere else in Europe. It's consistently polls that as more than 2/3 of the country want to move to a 4 day week, including more than half of Conservative voters. Interestingly, we're not sort of dramatically ahead of everyone in working hours. Apart from France are one of the kind of outliers because they moved to a 35-hour week, although there are a lot of exemptions in place which allow companies to get around that. But we are basically at the top of that league table in terms of longest full-time working hours. So yeah, I mean, even countries like Spain, Germany, much more productive economies. Holland, Iceland have actually, reduced their working week on average about 35 hours and have a much more productive economy because of it. So there does seem to be a clear link with reducing working hours and productivity going up across the board, and we're not in that game at all. We just seem to just be working more and more.
I think as well, it's sort of a necessity to move to a 4 day week, especially with automation. It's either that or we either automate and have loads of, millions of unemployed, or we do move and change our mindset, we view our workplace relations. So in regards to a 4 day week, surely that would offset, once automation comes, which will probably come in the next 10, 15, 20 years, that will be the key policy to prevent it becoming sort of a tool for mass unemployment, surely.
Exactly, and that's the way for automation not to be seen as a scary thing, and as actually as a positive for freeing us up to do other things in our lives. And I mean, it was interesting. John Maynard Keynes predicted in the 1930s that by now we'd all be working a 15-hour week, just because that was his prediction with the kind of acceleration of technology, and it just hasn't happened. It's the prediction that's turned out to be wildly inaccurate. Yeah.
God, imagine that. I'd absolutely love that. It's another important aspect, isn't it, with automation? It's another thing that, and maybe we can talk about, again, communicating it through, that it seems automation seems to be another area where it's hard, like you say, it's hard for the trade union movement on certain issues, because fundamentally, as a union, your role is to protect people's jobs and livelihoods. And it becomes difficult because when automation is clearly not used in workers' interest, and it's used for the interest of profits and actually probably exploiting workers even more, it's a difficult argument for the trade union movement to make. But with automation in hand with a 4 day week, it's our role as the left to really embrace that, because if automation done properly can be massively liberating for the trade union movement and for workers. But again, like you say, it's a difficult conversation to have, because the minute you come up against that threat of someone losing their job, you've almost failed your first role as a trade union. So is that maybe sometimes a conversation the left does struggle with sort of automation and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's a conversation. Yeah, we've been scared of for too long, and I think John McDonnell did some work on this in terms of looking at the benefits and embracing some of the positives of automation. Because if we don't, if we just exit from that debate, then nothing's going to stop the acceleration of new technology and automation. That's going to happen, I think, inevitably anyway on its own. So we have to be, as progressives, part of that conversation about how do we shape that to benefit people, because it is scary. If all these jobs are just disappear overnight, then how do people earn a living? So we need to input our ideas as part of automation, which will be making sure that people will still have enough, still have some work to be earning enough to be able to live. So I do think the left's been scared of that debate for too long. We can't just say that we're Luddites and we don't want this to happen. We need to be part of embracing it and working out how it's going to benefit people.
I think it's something me and Jarrad talked about a lot, in terms of, Jarrad mentioned earlier about the trade union movement being reactive in some instances over the potentially the last couple of decades, that we're at this crossroads now of post-pandemic. I mean, everything that comes with the pandemic and workers. We've got we have to move to a green economy, and we need, as a trade union movement, again, a difficult conversation to have with those industries that are net polluters. We've got obviously Brexit. Whatever your views are, there's a debate there for the trade union movement on workers' rights and things like that. It's seen as, and the 4-day week then plays a role in that, this really important point where if we don't take the front foot on these issues, if we don't take, like you say, it seems like shorter working weeks, because it's helpful for business, is coming down the track anyway, as is automation, etc., etc. So we need to be on the forefront of those debates, because otherwise we won't be the ones that are defining them and shaping them. And the 4-day week will actually be turned into a way of just trying to, like Jarrad said, of exploiting workers, and you're actually sat there at home at 9 o'clock still checking your emails and whatnot. So I just think it's such an important bit in history now, for particularly with the changes in the Labour Party, shall we say, for the trade unions to really take a role.
Yeah, I mean, I think that highlights why I have to say Keir Starmer's leadership so far is on that measurement has been a monumental failure, where he's just failed to think at all about the future world of work and any kind of forward-looking policies, because they're just not on the pitch at the moment. I mean, we'll see what happens with this new. Angela Rayner's been giving this shadow secretary for the future of work, which looks like an exciting role. We've already been in touch with her office about linking up on some stuff, so we'll see what comes from that. But yeah, the Labour Party and trade union movement need to be at the heart of that debate.
And yeah, I mean, Matt's our cousin was saying on the episode that it's the perfect time to speak to people's lived realities about work and about how, yeah, like we've said before, did you like the fact that over furlough you had lots of time at home, and you had lots of time to explore things and go and be creative and do a million and one things?
Well, we've not had upheaval, societal upheaval in this way since the Second World War. We're in a post-war moment, crying out for a kind of post-war speech, new solutions dramatically changing the way we all live our lives, and unfortunately Keir Starmer hasn't really been there.
And do you think, I mean, I know it's been passed at conference previously, are you just sort of waiting and seeing how these new changes go in terms of how Labour will engage with this issue? I mean, are you confident that it's going to be something that would form part of a bigger sort of policy shift, or are you still sort of, is it just a case of wait and see and work on the Labour Party where you can? We
hope so. I mean, we have been in Keir Starmer's touch about it, and they were kind of open to it, and had discussed it with us. We know there are a number of shadow front backbench ministers who support the 4-day week, and a lot of backbench MPs as well. So we've had quite positive conversations there. Andy McDonald, the Shadow Employment Rights Secretary, is supportive of it. And Momentum had as one of their 10 policies the 4-day week, which is good because it means they'll campaign for it at conference as well. So yeah, we will be putting it on the agenda, hopefully, for if conference takes place this year. And it would be great to see that policy passed as it was before, because it really is, if we're thinking about the future, and I was always struck by this stat that during the Miliband election, the Labour manifesto in the Miliband years was about, I can't remember what the exact figure was, but it was about 100 times less or something talked about the future and was all about the past, and it just let the Conservatives own the kind of future. And Labour, I have to say, the last year I haven't seen anything in terms of Labour feeling like they're setting the agenda for the future. And 4-day week is, it's the way the wind is blowing, and they'd be silly to ignore it.
And it's also one of those issues that seems, because post 2019 general election, when it was first sort of talked about, and like you say, there were a few difficulties in explaining it and making it cut through, that post the 2019 general election and post the pandemic seems now like a completely plausible and sensible policy, such as free broadband, which is now shooting back up in terms of its popularity again, because it's so clear why it's such a net benefit and importance to society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when you've got companies like Unilever and others adopting it, you've got SNP now, Nicola Sturgeon talking it up in the leadership debates, and them backing policy on it. It really has hit the mainstream.
Is there any other important points sort of with the campaign, Joe, that you wanted to go over? Any other sort of like important arguments that sort of the left needs to be making with regards to the 4-day week?
No, the amazing thing about the campaign, and I struggle with this sometimes, is there's so many arguments for a 4-day week, and we struggle to boil them down. Because, it's always, you always want about 3 key messages when you're trying to get through to people. Some of the other ones, there's real clear evidence that it'd be massively beneficial for the environment and climate change moving to a 4-day week, because it would immediately result in less carbon emissions through less commuting. Where people have more free time, they're more likely to engage in more environmentally sustainable behaviours. Whether it's having more time to cook a more sustainable meal rather than a ready meal, whatever it is. And also, there's a huge gender impact in terms of balancing the spread of care work, childcare, domestic work more equally between men and women, which seems to take place where the 4-day week is implemented. So there's so many arguments for it. And they're all around a better society. Also people having more time to volunteer in their communities, which is funny because it's territory that David Cameron used to speak about, the big society. We haven't shied away from making that point before. Obviously, I'm not a fan of David Cameron, but we are as much as possible trying to pitch this, not just strategically, but I don't necessarily. The 4-day week doesn't necessarily have to be a left-wing issue. It's a policy that's going to improve everyone's lives, give us all a better work-life balance, and so it is kind of for everyone.
I was just going to ask. Sorry, Dan. I was going to ask Joe, what can we do with sort of trade unionists, trade union reps, sort of up and down the country, even if it's in workplace branches or sort of regional branches and stuff? What can sort of we do to support the campaign?
So there's been a couple of key trade union members that have got in touch with me about getting motions passed at trade union conferences to either A, officially affiliate with the 4-day week campaign, or B, get the 4-day week passed as policy. And there was PCS. We were disappointed because the National Education Union had a motion or an amendment to be discussed on it, but there was some kind of mess up with the technology where they just didn't have time to discuss it, which was strange. It probably would have passed. But yeah, getting it talked about in branch meetings, as much as possible, being at the forefront of workers demanding it, through their branches and getting stuff passed at conference in support of it.
And have the TUC been strong on it as well in supporting the campaign? Me and Jarrad have slight criticism sometimes of the TUC, but have they been pretty strong and and happy to support you.
I wouldn't say they're actively doing loads on it, but yeah, Francis O'Grady and TUC have signed letters, joint letters we've done, and they have been supportive of it, and have been saying that publicly, haven't shied away from saying that publicly. So they could be, it could be taking it more seriously, I think, but we're happy they support the idea.
That's brilliant. So is there any sort of any of your work you want to share and advertise, and any other sort of resources or anything? Here's your space to list them.
We've got loads coming up. We've got lots of reports coming out in terms of, there's some gaps in the research in terms of how you'd implement it in schools, NHS, that we'll have out soon. There's also a big report coming out in the next 2 weeks about the benefits to the environment, and we've kind of managed to show how many emissions that 4-day week would reduce over the next 4 to 5 years. We're in a good place with a bunch of local councils where we hopefully might be in a position to have a few local councils trialing the 4-day week quite soon, which will be, I see, as the kind of next big step, because we have so long that the public sector could easily be a pioneer for this. If you had a government that was ready to implement it, might be difficult under this government. But yeah, follow the 4-day week campaign, get involved. We have monthly meetings. If anyone wants to be more involved in the campaign, then we always welcome new volunteers. And keep spreading the word. I think the more, I often say what's not to like about it, because what is not to like about working less for the same pay? But there is still some arguments to be won there, and I think some of our polling showed that actually for a lot of people, they don't know what they would do with that extra free time. So I think there's some strong cases to be made there in terms of, if you go back in history, one of the interesting ways that which is seen as a kind of groundbreaking moment in winning the weekend, was that they put the football on a Saturday at 3 p.m. And what that did was it embedded the idea that Saturday was a day of leisure. And I think we need something similar on a Friday that embeds Friday as a day of leisure. And maybe that's something in the community, or I don't know what that is yet. Maybe it's just going out to the pub, but we need something on that front. That's
definitely the policy lead, that Labour just basically has to do something that everyone does on 3 o'clock on a Friday and get that into the culture, and that's us done. That's us winning.
Yeah. Go to get. I mean, people do that anyway on a Friday, don't they? They go to the pub quite early. I mean, loads of offices, everyone's finished by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock on a Friday anyway. Maybe that's it.
That's a good point. Yeah, there is like a real Friday culture in the British workplace anyway, of basically post lunchtime you die off anyway. So it's just
but all the polls consistently show that Friday is the most popular day off. There are a lot of businesses where everyone wouldn't be able to have the same day off, and you'd have to switch it around, but most people would have Friday off, and it would transform the week for everyone. It'd be a really, really big change, and would make us immeasurably happier. So just spread the word. If follow us on Twitter, get in touch with the campaign if you'd like to be more involved.
Yeah, we'll put all the links in the show notes. I mean, I've just had a horrible vision that actually with an extra day off, we'd end up just all doing more activist work. But,
that's good though, because that's what you believe in. So that's fine.
Exactly. Yeah. Brilliant. So thanks so much for coming on. As I say, I'll put everything in the notes, and everybody follow the campaign and have that. Don't be afraid to have that conversation. I think I was slightly afraid of having a conversation about the 4-day week sometimes on doorsteps or whatnot in 2019. But I think especially with the pandemic, as you say, it's becoming an easier and easier argument to make, because who doesn't like more time at home and doing whatever? So anything you want to add, Jarrad?
No, I was going to say, it's been really informative, but it was something again that, like, just to echo what you just said, Dan, it's one of those things where you bring it up and sort of like the older generation, you're just lazy, or you just want an extra day in bed or something. But I think we saw during the pandemic, people were building like beer gardens. They were doing like little businesses. They were making cakes and stuff and just selling them, or doing like knitting. Knitting was a massive thing at one point. Like, it just goes to show
baking bread.
Yeah, like if you give people bread. Time, it gives them time to trial out stuff, to do stuff they enjoy, and they might pick up a new hobby that they've never even thought about doing. So I think, like you said, Joe, it's a win-win all round, and it's been really informative. I really enjoyed it, and the thing about the football, I never knew about as well. So really, I like that fact.
Well, next time you can invite me for some knitting on a Friday, I'll come and join.
Yeah, we'll sort it out. Do some crocheting.
Cheers, thanks a lot.
Right, thanks for having me on. Take care.
Cheers, thanks a lot, Joe.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye.
to the kitchen, pour myself a couple of fish and yawning, stretching, try to come to life. Jump in the shower, the blood starts pumping. Out on the streets, the traffic starts jumping. Fools like me on a job from 9 to 5, working 9 to 5. What a way to make a living. Barely getting by. It's all taken and no giving. They just use your mind, then they never give you credit. It's enough to drive you crazy when you love it. You love it. The right to dream, just to watch them shatter. It's just a step on the bottom's ladder. But you got dreams you'll never take away. You're in the same boat with a lot of your friends.